Bob Fitrakisd is a political science professor and lawyer from Columbus, Ohio. He was the election protection attorney on November 2nd, 2004 in Franklin County. He called the first public hearings to investigate voter suppression and election irregularities after the 2004 election and was one of 4 attorneys to file a challenge to Ohio's presidential election results in the Moss versus Bush and Moss versus Moyer lawsuits. With Harvey Wasserman, Fitrakisd co-authored the book How the GOP Stole America's 2004 Election and is Rigging 2008. Without further ado, let's welcome Bob Fitrakisd.
Ann Arbor area, of course, is very close to where I grew up in Detroit. My parents are actually in the audience from Redford, where they still live. And you're in a state where you're very, very lucky that the events that occurred in Ohio, while they occurred here on a much smaller scale. One of the things I'm learning as I speak around Michigan, beginning in Grand Rapids, is virtually the exact same things that I witnessed in Columbus, Ohio, took place in Grand Rapids. Today I got a report for a very similar instance in Flint, Michigan, and in 2000, similar incidents in East Lansing. So what I'd like to do quickly is sort of 3 things. The lead up to the election, sort of what happened in Ohio and how many ways I think it's a template as they're moving these approaches to other states. And then, of course, to explain what happened on Election Day and what obviously is the template for the future. Because unless you stop them from stealing, they're kleptomaniacs, right? And we've moved from a plutocracy ruled by the rich to kleptocracy ruled by thieves. And these people are absolutely ruthless. And part of the problem is mainstream Democrats somehow think if they're just nicer that they're going to prevail. No, we need to get these people into a 12-step program. First, they've got to admit we stole the election. We're sorry for it. We'll never do it again. We're a kleptocracy. And every day they need to be reminded. Because a lot of what happened was systematic. They can't really deny it. And there was, of course, a trial run to this that all of you are aware of. Florida. My perspective as a political scientist and as someone, in 1994, I co-wrote the report in El Salvador. I was an international election observer. I went down there. I co-wrote that report. I edited it. I delivered it to the United Nations. Virtually everything I was trained to look for in El Salvador in 1994, I didn't see in El Salvador, but I saw in Ohio in 2004. Which brings me to, in part, my thesis, is that which used to be done covertly in the Third World, what Frank Church of the Church Committee revealed as benign operations when we investigated the CIA back there in the mid-70s, is that those benign operations, rigging of elections, you don't have to kill anybody. You just have to stuff ballot boxes and manipulate candidates, is that type of covert operation was brought to the United States first in 2000 and on a grand scale in 2004 in Ohio. And that model, as the worldview of the president and the neocons behind him, as they move forward into the world with a very unpopular agenda, that as they lose their mandate at home, the only way they can succeed is by rigging elections here. And anyone who believes that people that wouldn't privatize torture and lie about it, anyone who believes that an administration that wouldn't lie about weapons of mass destruction and start a war, as they did in Iraq. Don't use the mic? Okay, don't use the mic. But anyone who believes that they're not going to essentially go into other countries, as they will continue to do so, that these same people would do all these things. Lie about weapons of mass destruction, break the covenant against torture, but they would never think of rigging elections in the United States. Really doesn't understand the nature of the Bush administration, of Karl Rove. I mean, if you go back and look at the history of these people, right, and you read an account of how Karl Rove became president of the Young Republicans, it sounds exactly like Ohio, just on a larger scale. Confusion reigned everywhere. If you look at the book Bush's Brain, or you've seen the documentary, nobody knew who was supposed to vote. So this is what happened in Ohio when you begin to look at a template of how they won. First of all, following the 2000 election, that they knew it would likely come down to Ohio in 2004. The fact that no Republican has ever won the president who has lost Ohio, that you have to win Ohio if you're a Republican to win the presidency, was not lost on the Bush administration, particularly Karl Rove, who rereads Machiavelli every year and likes to brag about it. So they knew where the battleground was going to be. What I found when I was looking at these events, and there were a lot of trial runs. Remember in the year 2000, now this is in the public record. This is not disputed. Remember that in 2000, the election was called for George Bush in Florida, despite an earlier call for again Al Gore, when 16,000 or so votes disappeared off a computer in Volusia County and were simply taken away by a computer. Then John Ellis, the cousin, first cousin of George Bush, calls the election for Bush. So there were these massive problems with computers. And the computer voting system itself is interesting. Just to briefly go over the history of computer voting. The first time that these e-voting machines were really used were what we call push and pray. Sort of push and you just pray they record the right candidate because they're so inaccurate. And that's what the General Accountability Office recently pointed out in its report. And if you haven't looked at it, you really need to look at the General Accountability Office report, which shows that these computers are massively inaccurate and vulnerable in terms of a vote count. It's one of the worst ways to count the vote. Now, as you recall, in 1988, the first time they were used was in New Hampshire, in the primary in New Hampshire. Shooptronics, Ransom Shoup was a decent guy. He'd only been convicted twice of election tampering in Philadelphia. But John Sununu brought these machines in. Bob Dole was winning by 8 points in the last tracking poll. He loses by 9. The Washington Post says, we didn't anticipate this incredible, sudden, last-second surge for the former CIA director, George Herbert Walker Bush. 17 points off the final polls are with these brand new e-voting machines, which have no paper trail, and think about the absurdity of this. They are partisan corporations run these machines. We privatized them. They are counting the vote with proprietary, secret software. The only democracy in the world. How is this acceptable? What don't the mainstream Democrats get about this? You cannot have private corporations secretly counting the vote with proprietary software. Absolutely unacceptable, and the starting point for any discussion of these electronic voting machines. Did you have a quick question or comment?
Yes, that anyone who has control of that electronic voting system has control of the vote.
Sure.
It doesn't matter if it's proprietary software or who it is.
Well, it makes it a lot easier if nobody knows what the code is and it's totally private. And I mean, we can talk about zillions of ways to. I mean, you can, any system that can be accessed by remote, any system where you can use the memory cards to hack into the system. I mean, the cover of Popular Science and Popular Mechanics Both were how to hack the vote in November 2004. So yeah, but it makes it a lot easier when you can't even look at what they're doing. It's like, no, it's a secret. At least what? Sure. It makes it cyber theft. And even better, as we'll talk about later, now that they're going to register people digitally as well, it's one-stop fraud. They can do everything from register the cyber votes. As we say in Ohio, the election's never over till the cyber vote comes in. So you got to wait for the rural cyber vote and see what actually is manufactured. And as we look at this, in part, Professor Friedman, who's at the University of Penn, statistician who's working on a book, should be out in April, what he found in the 2004 election is that about 1/3 of the Democratic voters for Kerry in rural counties throughout America that's dominated by Republicans, about 1/3 of those people were not in the certified vote. It's almost as if they disappeared and or were transferred, right? When you use computers, you can claim that's a glitch. They were accidentally assigned to the wrong party. So what's happening in Ohio to this day is a systematic attempt to take a step, and they've been successful at this so far, to take a swing state similar to Michigan and first of all, bring in all sorts of illegal money. So this is what you've really got to look for because they've been very successful in Ohio. They first began to purge the voting rolls in Cincinnati. Between 2001 and 2004, 305,000 people lost their right to vote in Ohio based on a law no one knew was in existence. An old Ohio law saying anyone who had not voted in the last 2 federal elections, even if they'd voted in a local election, could be purged. Now they were purged in Cincinnati, primarily in the inner cities, Cleveland, Toledo. They were systematically purged at the direction of the Secretary of the State, J. Kenneth Blackwell, co-chair of the Bush-Cheney re-election committee. So 305, including one couple on the front page of the Toledo Blade, been voting at the same address since 1960 when they cast the vote in that election. Called up and said, "Are we registered to vote?" Said, "Sure, you registered to vote." And then in late August, they were purged from the voter rolls. So this is what happens on one level. Systematic sneak purging of that we were 49th out of 50 in voter turnout, well ahead of Botswana, bodes well for us being the world's greatest democracy. So on one level, this is the type of an area where there's almost an agreement that you don't challenge the legitimacy of the American vote. So we end up in this counting office says the machines are very susceptible to hacking. But they're burying these stories, right? They're not front-page stories. I mean, they're front-page stories in Britain, but they're showing up on page A7, A13. Yeah, everywhere else but the United States. Yes?
Yeah, there were votes in 2005 and in November 2005, 4 initiatives at the state level to reform the election process. 2 of them had polls showing that they would carry, that they lost by wide margins.
Yeah, almost like the vote flipped. Yeah.
Any understanding of how that happened?
Well, I mean, if you look at the old rubric of kind of his mister, you know, the first thing you look at is history. Like people changed their mind in the last weekend, right? It was, 61% of the voters were supposed to go for the early voting, right? No excuse, absentee ballot, you can cast one, and or early voting. But apparently, in the last 5 days, there was a complete reversal in the people of Ohio that waited in lines up to 11 hours and in the inner city up to 7 hours, suddenly didn't want easy early voting. They wanted to vote in the cold rain, right? And that flipped. Now, the only interesting thing is they never go to the next step, which is implementation. Were the voting instruments we were using properly recording the vote? And the other thing, the implementation, is the question of whether they were recorded well. So you've got a question of implementation. Were the new voting machines, 41 Diebold machines, were they properly set up? And, of course, instrumentation, were they properly recording? Here's what we find in Ohio in the 2005 election. 187 memory cards were lost all night in Dayton County. That in Lucas County, no one knew how to take the 4 memory cards and take it down to 1 memory card, and so rovers had to be hired, including the Republican mayoral candidate, to pick up the cards. It just took them 3 or 4 hours longer to pick them all up, and they reported in the wee hours of the morning. The Dayton Daily News also said that the machines spontaneously recalibrated and switched the votes in transit, which is a story I really don't believe. But, I mean, they report this stuff in the mainstream newspaper. And when I say, look, it could be an instrumentation problem here, or an implementation problem, nobody knows how to work these new high-tech machines, is they go, no, people must have just changed their mind. And I'm saying, this is impossible. I'm telling you, in 4 days before the election, half the people didn't reverse their vote and vote against early, easy voting. You've got to look to something else, that these machines are not, in fact, correctly recording the vote. They're brand new technology, untrained workers, and you're reliant on a small group of private companies that supply the technician, like the Cheryl Eaton story, right? Think of what happened on the recount. Cheryl Eaton's the deputy director in Hocking County. On the day we're going to recount, Triad technicians, a Republican firm related, gives money to them, a Republican firm who still sells the commemorative butterfly ballot from Florida in 2000, on their website, one of their technicians shows up unannounced and fixes the machine. They've never had problem. It was a 14-year-old Dell, and they had a backup, another 14-year-old Dell. That's the central tabulator, right? The battery goes out. So instead of taking the battery from the other machine, he puts in a new hard drive and says, if you leave this machine on, and here are the papers, these numbers will match what's on the hard drive. So Cheryl Eaton swears out an affidavit to John Conyer. She's saying something is wrong here. This guy has never showed up, ever, unannounced, to work for free, other than the day of the recount. What happens? She gets fired. And in part, I interceded in her case. She now has an attorney. Do you know she was sexually harassing some of the really young? She's 66-year-old grandmother. She had this thing for 20-something technicians and harassed them a lot, so she had to be fired. So she was fired for blowing the whistle. I mean, what do? When one person comes forward, they lop off the head and put it on a pike and say, who's next? Who else? I mean, I went forward as election protection, legal advisor. 4 of us sued to get access because the massive irregularities. When you're watching an election screen at 1:43 in the morning with 100% of the vote in, and suddenly 19,000 more votes come in at the exact same percentage, like 32.84% for Kerry, you're thinking, did somebody just push a button? Did they just add about 6,000, 7,000 votes? When you see, Bush and Kerry votes, which should be Bush and Kerry, pop up, but 4,000 of those votes, the first initial vote, are in the Cobb column, who's not even on the ballot, and then they disappear. You're thinking votes are disappearing. So we actually PDF'd the screen. We had people in place. We recorded those things. We had sworn statements. What happened? They threatened to sue us. They threatened to sanction us. They claimed we were insane. We never got to put out our evidence. I did put out a 767-page book. I'm now working with the New Press to put out another 400-page book so people can actually look at the evidence. What did they do? I mean, they controlled the courts. They told us that we were supposed to have 10 days under law, under statute, to do discovery. They told us not only did we not have 10 days, that the other side didn't have to answer anything for 14 days, which meant that we got no discovery. We took it anyway, and they got all this discovery. And meanwhile, they're trying to sanction us individually and fine us personally, which won't be covered by our malpractice. And they kept saying, if you drop these lawsuits, we'll let the sanctions go. And since I was, you're under all this tension, at the time, I flipped them off every time I spoke, hoping to bait them into a hearing where I could actually put on the evidence. To this day, there's still the 92,000, 93,000 uncounted votes. I mean, what they're doing is that unless we protect the vote, it's not going to be protected. Yeah, go ahead.
Are the precincts in Ohio
No, there's a new state law that will require this year for the first time voter verifiable paper trails. Some counties had those machines, but didn't put any paper in them. No, they can't be. And a lot of the voter verified paper trail, you can't read them. A lot of them are thermo paper that disappears like you get it from the bank machine. So by the time you get to it, it's sort of, you need the forensic experts from the FBI to read the actual results. I mean, it should come down in a window. You should be able to push, and you see what shows up. And that should be a voter verified paper ballot of record, to be recounted or counted right there at the precinct. That's not what they're doing. A lot of times they'll put these little tiny rolls like you get at the ATM, because that's what Diebold did. It was an ATM maker. Prior to that, a safe maker, right? So are you really going to recount off that little tiny roll? So we have to be very clear that we need a voter verified paper ballot, not a voter verified paper trail.
Real quickly, can you talk about the 3 lawsuits that are currently in Ohio, and if the legal system is corrupt, as you say, what's really the chance of them really going through and winning?
Okay. Yeah, she's asking about the 3. Which 3 suits are you thinking of? There's probably about 30 now.
Oh, is there 30?
Yeah.
Okay, there were 3 big ones that I knew of that included the civil.
Okay.
Also included the election.
Okay, the big ones. It was moot at the moment. George Bush was elected. President. The Electoral College vote was certified after the first ever challenge in the history of the country. The election challenge was moot. I mean, we ran through every scenario doing our job as attorneys. Can we send the Ohio National Guard to Washington to remove the president and arrest him and bring him back to Ohio? We ran through, quite literally, every scenario humanly possible to see if there was any remedy under state law should we prevail. At the moment, we realized there was no remedy under state law. We reluctantly had to stop the suit, although we have not stopped collecting evidence. In fact, I spent the past week undergoing a project where I have put on notice through public records request and through my law firm that every single, that we want every ballot preserved in Ohio. We want to publicly inspect them. Also for the Hackett election, particularly in Claremont County. They're on notice there. And the 2005 election, which we were running up against on Monday, we're now out of time. But we have these public records requests around, incredibly elaborate, including the audit logs for the computers. In some anticipation, we may get forensic computer experts to tear it apart. So we're busy fighting all over the state of Ohio to preserve the record. We're applying for grants for digital archiving projects. We're dealing with the Ohio Historical Society. So we're fighting that, but we lost it legally. The recount, which was the second major one, which was very important, there were 2 recounts. Here's what happened. Under Ohio law, it requires a random recount. What happened is J. Kenneth Blackwell decided random meant non-random, right? Random simply means there's an equal chance of inclusion of all precincts or ballots being counted. He decided that private companies and the Board of Election could pre-select the ones they wanted to count, which is random, right? You kind of. I did a hearing in Toledo where a Board of Elections person shows up and goes, "Yeah, here's how we did it. The Diebold technicians came in and said, recount these 8 counties. One of them was missing its memory card, so they plugged in a new memory card that matched exactly what was going on." So that was the recount. So in this August, there is a hearing. John Boniface, the attorney of National Voting Rights Institute, one question: are the people of Ohio actually, under the Constitution, are they entitled to a recount as guaranteed by Ohio law? That's the only question left to be decided. The third case that is still out there is Cheryl Eaton. Well, there's a couple other cases. The Cheryl Eaton case is Cheryl is now fired. We intervened as whistleblowers through the Alliance for Democracy to make sure that they couldn't replace her. They're now in intense negotiation they want to buy her out and have her go away. But much to her credit, I mean, Cheryl Eaton's a real hero. I mean, she actually showed up at the Board of Election after having unsuccessful brain surgery on an aneurysm with staples in her head and pointed out what they were going to do. She also got the Hocking County Democratic Party to rescind their appointments to the Board of Election, at which the Democrats on the board ran to J. Kenneth Blackwell and said, we're not appointed by the Democrats. We're appointed by the Republican Secretary of State. And of course, Ohio law says, yes, indeed, even though they're Democrats, they are appointed by J. Kenneth Blackwell, and they serve at his pleasure. So that's the other suit. The last suit is we actually won one to keep the polls open late. We argued that they had to keep the polls open late in Franklin County and in Knox County, where Kenyon College was. We sued, Cliff Arnebeck and I, the Alliance for Democracy. The Democratic Party actually joined this suit one of the few times. Then we won, got a temporary restraining order. The Republican Party appeals to the Sixth Circuit. The Democrats drop out. So it goes back to federal court. The Democrats are about to win, so we intervened, and essentially the judge ruled it moot and that there was no default judgment for the Republican Party. But they would have had the right, which was their position, to close the polls exactly at 7:30. But we did win that one, is that the polls can stay open and the people in line at the official closing time, those people do have a right to vote. So that was a small victory.
Yes, in October, women's progressive activists had forums on election reform. We had 3 speakers from Ohio who were veterans of the reform movement, among them attorney Joanne Carasset.
Oh, sure.
And she said that voters in Ohio very much support reform. And the problem, of course, is...
Well, that's what the polls showed. The machine showed something else.
Beg pardon?
The poll showed they did. The machine showed something else.
Right. So I wondered if you would comment on what you think is actual opinion in Ohio as contrasted with the...
Yeah, it's like, look, I mean, I believe that the polls were right. 61% of the population or so wanted early voting and no excuse absentee voting, and nearly 60% wanted to remove the $10,000 individual donations. I think these new machines, which they brought in, that nobody was trained on, recorded it wrong. In fact, the city of Carlisle in Ohio is now suing because a continuing levy for their fire department, apparently nobody there wants fire protection anymore. And what they were able to do is look at the numbers and say, look, 250 people didn't vote against this because there are only 150 people are registered. So they're beginning to do the basic analysis that we began to do, in Perry County. Like, look, there couldn't have been 124% voter turnout. It's impossible. There couldn't have been 120% voter turnout. We're not buying this. John Kerry did not run behind 2 sacrificial lamb sheriff and county commissioner in a Republican county. He didn't get 5,000 votes less, and 10,000 people did not go out and vote for gay rights and for George Bush in these counties. The numbers don't make any sense. And if people would just look at the numbers, and that's what the General Accountability Office suggests, is that a lot of these are easily recounted. In Ohio, we have ballot rotation. I mean, look, third-party candidates in Cleveland, in a black ward, did not vote for a white supremacist constitutional law candidate. He didn't get 41% of the vote. The last election, Gore got 91%. That's what we keep pointing out, that there's problems in using these devices to record these results.
Yeah, I have a 2-part question on strategy on dealing with this. First, taking legal action versus trying to educate the population. If you had $100,000 to spend, how much would you spend on which?
Oh, that's a tough. I actually would probably spend it on education, forums, and creating websites in all 50 states so people can begin to coordinate and watch their own state and do it county by county. I don't know any other possible way we can do it. It really depends on which state you're in. In the state of Ohio, you're not going to go very far with any lawsuit in a state where there's no statewide official who's a Democrat, and you're suing counties where there's no Democratic officials, and essentially they don't seem to adhere to the general procedures of law. So it really depends on what state you're in. If you got a state where you actually got a prosecutor, I mean, think about the power of a good prosecutor with Tom DeLay down there in Austin, right? If you're in the right area and you got a prosecutor with some guts, you can actually, and these people are really sloppy, you can actually find their paper trail fairly easy. So it depends on where I was.
And then if you're educating people, who are the people that you want to educate and what do you want them to do? So for example, I had seen John Conyers on C-SPAN. So I knew a small percentage of what you were talking about. I now have a lot more data, but I'm not sure that when I talk to my Republican cousin in Toledo, that it will make any difference to her, because cognitive dissonance will keep her from accepting that it's any different. Are there, and a lot of the Democratic leadership is spineless, so they're not necessarily going to change. Are there, you see that there's Democrats who don't know this information, that if they knew it, they would do something, and what do we want them to do?
Well, I think the battle in the Democratic Party is over, I mean, the people that you didn't have to sell right away were the Black Caucus, the Progressive Caucus. I think there is a huge split in the party between mainstream Democrats or DLC types who think if we're nicer, we have better candidates, this will go away, we don't want to marginalize ourselves. Again, my position is there's a battle going on for the soul of the Democratic Party. That unless we realize that it is fundamentally wrong for private companies to secretly count our vote, I don't even know why in the hell we're contesting these things. On some level, it's stupid. So I think we've got to battle. Not only do we have to educate, make sure all the progressives know, but we need to take that ammunition and not let up on the local Democratic parties, not let up on the county areas, and not let up on these boards of elections. Is that they want to keep saying, yeah, that's one issue. No, it's the primary issue. If one side owns the voting machines, owns the electoral process, and is willing to physically intimidate and do everything within the law, legally and outside the law, to repress people, unless that is stopped, we're never going to get fair elections. We're going to come close. Yeah, nationwide. Because I think what Friedman said at the University of Pennsylvania, there's missing votes. I mean, the exit polls, which are incredibly accurate everywhere else but the United States, that the universal laws of statistics are not suspended at the U.S. border, is that they apply here, and that what we got to do is, I don't think the Republicans are the problem. Quite frankly, I think it's the Democratic Party.
I'm really curious to get information from the group here about what they've learned from you tonight and what they're going to do. Because I've taught statistics at the university level. I'm a software person, probably the only software movement.
So, yeah, you probably don't have to be convinced.
I'm like a skewed part of the population. I'm curious, show of hands, how many people here already thought we shouldn't have proprietary voting machines? So I think this speaks to who do you talk to and what do you get them to do. Is it a question of educating more people who don't know about this, or is it a question of getting the people who are sympathetic
and getting you organized on a statewide level, and getting your website up, and getting your speakers bureau up? I mean, you need to go on and convince the people of Michigan. You have the skills, you have the knowledge, you have the, and you've got public access.
Right? We'll be doing video blogs because that's what I do professionally.
Good.
So we'll be spreading.
Yeah. Now the reason I'm here. Yeah.
Big media is not reporting.
Right.
We have to do our own media.
No, I agree with you. We need to take back democracy and take back the media. So I'm not here to educate you. I'm here to give you the pitch as to what I actually saw and how appalled I was by it, and to make sure that you set up, because there's a lot of people in Grand Rapids and there's a lot of people in Lansing who already know about it too. So the question is to simply link people up with your skills and make sure it doesn't happen in Michigan.
What's
Okay, 2 more questions. Okay, one right here and one more in the back. Go ahead.
After Florida in 2000, I think a lot of people were afraid to look like sore losers. Talking about Ohio, that's probably why the Democratic National Party spoke the way they did about it. Do you think that distance from Florida is letting us speak more about these? Do you think the Ibrahim scandal is going to help us turn the kind of color of this topic at all?
Well, let's look at the positive aspects. Well, first of all, Jimmy Carter last year said he thought Florida was stolen, right? And it's like nearly 4 years later, more than 4 years later, he comes around to what many of us probably realized that day when they were stealing it. John Kerry recently on Ed Schultz began to talk about the private machines right before Christmas. His wife earlier in Seattle, at that luncheon, kind of blurted out they can hack the mother machines, referring to the central tabulators. Look, John Kerry knows what happened. I briefed John Kerry. I explained a lot of the stuff I explained to you today, but in great detail. What? I talked to him right after the election.
Support Conyer then?
I talked to people who were in the meeting, and I can give you the rundown. Robert Shrum beat the hell out of him and said he would be a sore loser. Is that he would not be viable in 2008. The first and foremost consideration that came out was whether he would be viable in 2008. And Shrum convinced him that he would be a sore loser and marginalized. John Edwards wanted the fight. There was a knockdown drag-out. They also were considering the Fallujah situation and whether or not there was a smoking gun. Who he asked for the smoking gun is the weirdest part of all this. John Kerry's attorney in Ohio was Daniel Huffheimer, who works for Bob Taft's law firm, Taft Stentinius. So the person, he's a probate attorney. I mean, among progressive attorneys, he's absolutely unknown. So I was talking to one of his local attorneys who I'm a good friend with. I'm going, who's advising him on this? Daniel Huffheimer. Who's that? Well, he's a probate attorney for Taft Stentinius, the Taft family's law firm. So I'm not sure he got the best information. But when I told John Kerry what I told you today, and he was also briefed, Jesse Jackson got through to him, Cliff Arnebeck, we told him, this is happening nationwide. These numbers are very dubious. You need to look at the exit polls. He said one thing. He goes, wherever they used those machines in New Mexico, I lost, regardless of the Democratic or Republican registration numbers. John Kerry knew something was going on. He made a calculated decision because of Fallujah and our boys in harm's way, and to remain viable in 2008, not to challenge the vote. And I think that is fundamentally one of the worst mistakes that's ever been done, because if Kerry would have fought, the eyes of the world would have been on there, and they did this very quickly, and they were very sloppy, and they left trails all over, and he made a tremendous mistake not to fight. So people like myself, who were independents, election protection, we were vilified as being crazy because Kerry wouldn't fight. Now we do have an open window now. As the president's credibility falls, their solution to stay in power is going to become more repressive. We have the perfect window at this time. You got a president out there saying he's got spy powers. You just want to go, what else? X-ray vision? I mean, what sort of fantasy world do you live in? They're at the peak. They're going to get more desperate. I know that. But we need to go after that. Oh, well, I think if we go out there. One last question.
Hi. I actually have people who I work with who were deep inside the Kerry campaign. And so I got permission before I came here tonight. And I can tell you that after the election, he had a choice to face, whether or not to fight like Thor and to look like a sore loserman, which everybody saw was fairly ineffective. But Kerry decided to instead go undercover, and he actually hired investigators to find the information that they could to prove that it was stolen. So they did not roll over and play dead. In fact, they still have...
Oh, they're still undercover.
They,
I'm waiting for him to surface. I mean, I know his attorney.
Lawsuits still pending.
Which ones?
I can't really name the three.
Okay.
They have civil rights violations. They have one about the election, I believe.
The civil rights was a consortium of people for the American way, League of Women Voters, which is a good lawsuit.
However, they also had whistleblowers who they have tried to get to testify about it, the same as what you probably have. And as of yet, they were very close to finding whistleblowers to come forward. But on November 3rd, they did not have that. So he and his wife Teresa went out on a limb to find who could do it. They hired people. They hired investigators. So there's multiple ways of fighting things. And on November 3rd, there was not a smoking gun, as you say. There were anomalies, but they tried to...
10 hour.
Well, what they're going to do is what they should have done. Excuse me, can I finish?
Oh, you can get it online. You can go, just put in General Accountability Office election, and it's there. It was on the freepress.org, my website, with an article talking about it where you could click right on. But how many people in here have seen the General Accountability Office report? So everyone should take a look at that, because all you have to do is hold it up, and it totally nonpartisan, proves our point. And it also has created openings, and it may be one of the reasons why Kerry has been talking about the machines, at least recently. Yeah. General Accountability Office. Just Google General Accountability Office. GAO. No, they switched it. Yeah, they switched that. It's General Accountability Office. It was the General Accounting Office, but somehow it's now the Accountability Office, whatever that means. But they still do the same thing. Yeah. So it's the General Accountability Office, and freepress.org. If you go to our election coverage and scan down, you'll see a variety of things, including an article which we wrote about the General Accountability, and should be able to click on there. That's freepress.org.
I'd like to turn the floor over to Jan Door
Sure.
at this point, and Bob, you'll still be around for another
Yeah.
half hour?
Yeah, I'll stick around.
Jan is going to talk with us for a little bit, and we'll have probably another Q&A session more focused on Michigan and what's happening here locally. So here's Jan and Dora.
Thank you, Mary. Some of you know me as the Deputy Clerk for Pittsfield Township, and the good news is that in Michigan we are working on election reform. We have built a Washington County Alliance, and we are starting to reach out to the rest of the state to link up with the Progressive Michigan Alliance and a number of other organizations, so that we will have a statewide, nonpartisan reform effort. We have some very serious vulnerabilities in our election system in this state. We've been extremely lucky. The whole thing has worked as a kind of honor system, but when dishonorable people show up, honor systems don't work anymore. So we have got to make some changes that will protect our election system. Over the last year here in Washington, we've been working very hard to identify the vulnerabilities and to come up with solutions. The WPA flyer, the yellow flyer that many of you picked up, the election repair kit, reflects those priorities that we've identified. And many of the members of WPA are here today. Show of hands. Yay. We also have Gray Panthers who are involved. We have Democracy for America folks who've been working really hard. Members of the Democratic Party's Voter Protection Committee. Jeff Souza, are you here? He may have stepped up. Next Sunday here from 2 until 4 is the monthly meeting of the Voter Protection Committee. This is where we're doing a lot of work on the very important details of figuring out what will work. Next fall is a critical election, and it'll really determine what our strategy is, because many of the key reforms that we're supporting and that we've identified have been introduced as bills. Senator Liz Brader has tried to introduce bills for election day registration. That would get rid of most of these crazy problems with registration issues. 6 states already have election day registration. A 7th state doesn't have any registration at all, and their elections work just fine. Voter registration is a rather recent invention, and we may actually not need it, because when you think about it, it makes just a barrier to people voting, and it means that you have to go through a 2-step process rather than a single process. So there is a major movement across the country to institute election day registration and get rid of those god-awful provisional ballots, which are nothing but a disaster. We also have seen bills introduced for no-reason absentee voting. And essentially that's early voting in Michigan as well. But those bills aren't going anywhere under the current legislature. Liz can't even get them out of committee. So we're going to have to see what happens in 2006 and whether we can elect more people from either party who support election reform and voter rights. If that doesn't happen, then we're going to need everyone in this room, because we're going to need about 600,000 signatures to amend the state constitution so that we can get a voter's Bill of Rights in our constitution, so that the right to vote is a constitutional right, which it is not right now. I hope we don't have to do that. It's not just the work of getting it on the ballot, but then you have to raise the money to campaign for it. And one of the problems with the Ohio effort is I don't believe that they had enough resources to overcome the trickery in their campaign for their reform. So it's going to be very tough if we have to do it the hard way. But I would invite everyone here who's not already linked up with our Washington County efforts, if you would like to become involved in the Michigan effort to form an election reform alliance, please give me your information, and we will get you involved as soon as possible. And I'd be glad to take any questions. Do we have Republicans? Yes. I would have to say that Helen Neal, the clerk of York Township, is very supportive of election reforms. There are a number of Republican election administrators. So, you know, it never used to be a partisan issue, the right to vote. And for many people, it still isn't. And we hope to broaden that.
Just to add that the Michigan Association of County Clerks, of which I'm a member, being county clerk, which is overwhelmingly Republican, they're strongly in support of No Reason AB, and the lobbyist for the County Clerks Association tells us absolutely no way would the legislature ever consider it. The Republicans have decided it's not going to go to them. I said the Republicans in the legislature, the leadership said they're actually going to prevent that bill from going anywhere. But the County Clerks Association, just to add to Jan's point, almost all the county clerks are Republican. Only the larger counties, a few of them have Democrats, a few in the UP. But when I go to these meetings, everyone there is for No Reason AB. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm Larry Kestenbaum. I'm the county clerk in Richard Deeds in Washington County.
There's an important distinction to make between election fraud and voter fraud. We are talking about election fraud as the wholesale theft of elections. Our research shows there is actually almost no individual voter fraud at all in the state, and it hasn't been for the last 10 years.
Two questions, Jan. First, the governor is running for re-election. Is the Secretary of State also running for re-election?
Yes.
As a result, and correct me if I'm wrong, as a result of her rulings, Ann Arbor lost voting machines that were much less fraudulent, and now we have Diebold machines in the entire county. How do we propose to reverse that?
We need to get rid of Terry Lynn Land, who is the Secretary of State currently, and that's the solution to that. Well, we don't have a Democrat running yet. I've been looking far and wide. Traditionally, the Democrat for Secretary of State comes from the city of Detroit. Right now, we don't have a Detroit person in a statewide office. I have someone in mind that I'm trying to persuade to run. But if anyone else has any good ideas, we need to change that, because in Michigan, the Secretary of State has enormous discretion and tremendous power. And it was Terry Lynn Land who decided to standardize on optical scan machines. It was Terry Lynn Land who forced Washtenaw County to go with AccuVote by Diebold, even though by precinct vote, the most popular machine was a completely different model. Cheryl, did you want to share?
That's the problem. How do we make the Diebold scanners work properly? That was my question.
Well, they're very hackable. We have some very smart people at the University of Michigan that are working on developing an on-site audit system so that before the polls are closed up at night, before the ballots are locked up, we can actually on-site do an audit to make sure that there hasn't been a satellite signal sent down and to change the Diebold machine.
Would it be effective to start a fight against Diebold? Just have, just everybody, I don't know how many states are involved in this, but a lot. And if somehow we could just use the computers and just, attack the company, maybe the company would have to bow out or change their software.
Certainly a good idea. It looks like Wally Odell is being investigated for corporate fraud, so people may be doing themselves in. They may not need our help. Any other questions? Announcements? Okay, Bob.
Briefly, my name is Bob Alexander from Clemson. A number of you know me from a number of efforts that we did down here in Washington County over the last 30 years. Now, what do you want me to do? Move it closer? Okay. I just want to give you a little insight into some new things that are happening this year. I was a Democratic candidate in the 8th Congressional District against Mike Rogers in 2004. It's Livingston, Ingham, Oakland. And we have 9 Republican members of Congress, 6 Democratic members of Congress. Those 6 Democrats get lots of funding from the Democratic Party and the powers that be. The 9 Democrats who challenge the Republican incumbents get very little. And what happens is that, like in this coming November, voters in those 9 congressional districts, many of them, go vote for Granholm for governor. They vote for Stabenow for U.S. Senate. They get to Congress, and because that campaign was very poorly funded and I don't know who that person is. I only know the well-known Republican. So I'll vote for that Republican. And many of those voters then either don't continue to vote or they don't come back and vote for the Democratic state senator or the state rep. That's why we don't have Democratic control of the state house and the state reps. And I made a proposal to the state party a few months ago to say we need to get together a group, mostly of volunteers, who will help write press releases, who will help do statements, who will help do fundraising help, and many other things to help these candidates. The state party and the powers that be aren't going to give each of these 9 candidates a lot of money because they're likely not going to win. But we want to make them successful challengers so they're well known, so that we stop this fall off, so that Democrats in those 9 congressional districts vote for Granholm and Stabenow, Democrat for Congress, and then Democrat for state rep and state senator, and we get back Democratic control of the state house, and we also might elect 1 or 2 more people to the Congress. I want to point out that here in Washtenaw County, most of the people here today probably are in the 15th Congressional District, and you got Diebold. How many people are in the 7th Congressional District with Schwartz? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay. This is, for those of you who are in Washtenaw County in the 15th, you may want to spend a little time going into Whitmore Lake or Salem Township or over into western Washington or down to Jackson or Lenawee to help whoever the Democratic candidate is. I'm trying to get this proposal through the state party, and at the same time I'm here tonight to encourage those folks in Washington on 15 to help look at the 7th or some of the other, like the Mankato, the 12th. Well, the 11th district, there you go. In the last election, the candidate there spent $38,000 and got 40% of the vote against Mankato, who had 1.2 million. That's the closest place that we have a chance of beating a Republican who's likely to be running for re-election. I want to point out in the 7th Congressional District, and I'll end on this, if Schwartz has only Tim Walberg as his opponent in the Republican primary, remember he had 5 Republicans running against him, and he got 27% of the vote to win then. If Walberg gets all these other folks not to run again, it's likely that Walberg might win the Republican primary. Suddenly, all those Democrats who voted for Schwartz, all the independents, and some Republicans might look at Nancy Reiner or someone else who is a Democratic candidate. So you might be going 2 ways, east to the 11th and north, west, and south to help in the 7th. So if you want to chat with me for a few minutes after this, I'm happy to talk with you. Thank you.
Again, I'm Larry Kassenbaum. I'm County Clerk and Registrar of Deeds of Washington County. One thing that I wanted to just make sure that you all knew, just so that no one left the room with that misconception. There's been mention in Ohio and Florida of how they did criminal record searches and purges and so forth. That's not an issue in Michigan. It shouldn't be. Okay, as long as you're not incarcerated, your criminal record has nothing to do with your voting rights in Michigan. And anyone who thinks, I mean, there may be Republicans trying to spread that rumor that people, oh, you've got a criminal record, you can't vote. That's not a problem in Michigan. Michigan, you're 18 years old, you meet all the other criteria. It doesn't matter whether you had what kind of background you might have had. So so again, if you ever hear that, make sure people understand that's not. Yes, that's right. Go ahead.
I can wait till you're done.
Okay. All right. So that was just one thing I wanted to, because there was discussion of that in Ohio, and it is an issue in Ohio. It is an issue in some other states. In Michigan, it's not. As long as you're not incarcerated, your voting rights are not affected.